Es un gusto para nosotros invitarlos al primer Congreso Internacional de la Investigación Jurídica Empresarial 2025-1, donde hablaremos de contrato de trabajo, jornada de trabajo, periodo de prueba, causales de terminación de contrato, indemnización por terminación de contrato, indemnización por finalización de contrato por justa causa y por último liquidación de contrato a término fijo indefinido. Con nuestros invitados la doctora María Paula González, el doctor Juan Felipe Boada y por último el doctor Juan Pablo Pinzón, especialistas en Derecho Laboral. Se llevará a cabo el día 7 de mayo de 2 pm a 3 pm. Nos ubicamos en el kilómetro 2 vía Cajicá-Zipaquirá en la Universidad Militar Nueva Granada. Tomando como referencia la portería principal, nos dirigiremos a la plazoleta de banderas. De ahí llegaremos al parqueadero administrativo, desde donde al costado derecho se verá el edificio Sepúlveda. Enseguida el edificio Aulas 2, donde encontraremos el aula Escalab 202. Te esperamos.
Es un honor darles la bienvenida al primer Congreso Internacional de la Investigación Empresarial. Soy el doctor Juan Felipe Boada Rincón, experto en periodo de prueba.
Con la doctora María Paula, especialista en contrato de trabajo y causales de terminación de contrato de trabajo.
And I'm Juan Pablo Pinzón Arias, Dr. Juan Pablo Pinzón, specialist in working hours and compensation for termination of a contract with just cause. Throughout this session, we will explore key aspects that impact the business world, combining expertise, perspective, and of course, both languages to enrich this experience. Welcome.
En Colombia, el contrato de trabajo es el acuerdo fundamental que rige la relación entre el empleador y el trabajador. Se encuentra regulado principalmente por el Código Sustantivo del Trabajo. Elementos esenciales del contrato de trabajo. Para que exista un contrato de trabajo en Colombia debe concurrir obligatoriamente 3 elementos, según el artículo 23 del Código Sustantivo del Trabajo. El número 1 es la actividad personal del trabajador. El empleado debe realizar labor por sí mismo. El segundo es continua subordinación o dependencia. El empleador tiene la facultad de impartir órdenes, fijar horarios y exigir el cumplimiento de las labores. El tercero es el salario. Es la remuneración con la que se recibe el trabajador por la prestación de su servicio. Si estos 3 elementos están presentes, se entiende que existe un contrato de trabajo sin importar el nombre que se le dé. Tipos de contrato de trabajo. Los principales tipos de contratos de trabajo en Colombia, según su duración, son contrato a término indefinido. No tiene una fecha de finalización preestablecida. Es el más común y estable y se mantiene mientras persistan las causas que le dieron. Origen o no se dé por terminado con o sin justa causa. Contrato a término fijo. Tiene una duración específica pactada por escrito que no puede ser inferior a 1 año ni superior a 3 años. Puede ser renovado indefinidamente si el contrato es menos de 1 año. Puede renovarse por 3 periodos iguales o inferiores y a partir de la 4ª renovación la duración debe ser mayor a 1 año si no se da. Si no se da aviso de terminación con al menos 30 días de anticipación, se renueva automáticamente. Contrato por obra o labor determinada. Se celebra para la relación de una tarea o proyecto específico y su duración está ligada al tiempo que se requiere para finalizar esa obra o labor. Debe constar por escrito y no es renovable automáticamente. Se termina cuando la obra o labor concluye. Contrato ocasional, accidental o transitorio. Su duración no excede de 30 días y se realiza para labores distintas a las actividades normales del empleador. Importante es que todos los contratos labores, ya sean escritos o verbales, garantizan al trabajador el acceso a todas las prestaciones sociales y beneficios de ley, prima de servicios, cesantías, vacaciones, aportes a seguridad social y salud y pensión, riesgos laborales. Obligaciones principales del empleador. Pagar el salario en las condiciones pactadas y las prestaciones sociales, como prima, cesantías, vacaciones. Afiliar y realizar los aportes al sistema de seguridad social integral, como salud, pensión, riesgos laborales. Suministrar los instrumentos y materiales de trabajo. Garantizar un ambiente de trabajo seguro y proteger la salud del trabajador. Respetar la dignidad del trabajador. Otorgar certificados de trabajo al finalizar la relación laboral del trabajador, entre otras. Realizar personalmente la labor contratada, acatar órdenes e instrucciones, cumplir con el reglamento interno del trabajo. Conservar en buen estado los instrumentos y útiles facilitados por el empleador.
En el día de hoy seguiremos con el curso gratuito sobre la economía de la empresa. En este capítulo hablaremos sobre los elementos esenciales del contrato de trabajo. El contrato de trabajo es un acuerdo por el que una persona con la capacidad legal para trabajar se compromete personal y voluntariamente a realizar un trabajo para otra persona, que puede ser física o jurídica, bajo su autoridad y a cambio de una remuneración. Para que sea válido, dicho acuerdo debe tener al menos los siguientes elementos esenciales. 1. La identidad de las partes del contrato de trabajo. 2. La duración de la jornada laboral. Se debe especificar la fecha de comienzo de la relación laboral y, en el caso de un contrato de duración determinada, su duración prevista. Además, se deben especificar el número de horas semanales que realizará el trabajador. 3. El domicilio social de la empresa. O, si esto no es posible, el domicilio del empresario y el lugar de trabajo en el que el trabajador presta habitualmente sus servicios. Si el trabajador presta habitualmente sus servicios en distintos centros de trabajo o en centros de trabajo móviles o ambulantes, deberá indicarse esta circunstancia. 4. La categoría o grupo profesional del puesto de trabajo que ocupa el trabajador. Se deberá realizar una breve descripción del puesto laboral de forma que se le permita al trabajador conocer con suficiente claridad el contenido específico del trabajo. 5. La cuantía del salario base inicial y de los posibles complementos salariales adicionales, así como la periodicidad con la que se pagan. 6. La duración de las vacaciones y las condiciones en que se disfrutarán. 7. Los plazos de preaviso que deben respetar tanto el empresario como el trabajador en caso de rescisión del contrato. 8. El convenio colectivo aplicable a la relación laboral, indicando los detalles específicos que permiten identificarlo.
Buenas tardes, ¿estamos con?
Nubia Quintero.
Nubia, ¿tú qué entiendes por contrato de trabajo?
Es un acuerdo entre dos personas en la cual una da la... no.
Hi Paula, about the question that you asked me about the employment contract, I understand that this is a legal agreement between the employer and the employee, and it can be verbal or written, and in that they decide, for example, the salary, the benefits, the duration of that, the responsibilities, and the termination clause are, for example, the both agreement when both don't want to continue with that contract, the resignation, the dismissal for just cause, or disability or death for the employer. So that is everything. Thanks.
Buenas tardes, ¿estamos con?
Karen García.
Karen, ¿tú qué entiendes por contrato de trabajo?
Un contrato de trabajo es una relación laboral entre dos o más personas que se realiza con el fin de cumplir un objetivo.
Contrato de trabajo.
Bueno, buenas tardes, primero que todo, mi nombre es Jairo. Es el reglamento que tenemos todos los colombianos sobre derecho al trabajo. Por ejemplo, en mi trabajo, mi horario de trabajo son 6 horas. Es lo permitido para un animal porque trabajo con un animalito aquí. Bueno, y como es una empresa privada, tenemos derecho a unas prestaciones, a una indemnización, a una incapacidad, depende de lo que el descanso que tengamos en la jornada de trabajo.
Gracias.
Hi, Paula. So to answer your question, what is a job contract? So basically, a job contract letter is a written agreement that confirms the details of a job offer, and set expectations for both the employer and the employee. It's normally typically given to a candidate after they have been selected for the position and agree to join the company. Job contract letters normally have, like I said before, the employer and employee details, the job title and description, your start date, how long you're going to be at that job. It will also detail your work schedule, your compensations and benefits that you receive, and if for example, there's a probationary period. Also, it will let you know if the termination clause, if you do get to the point where you will be terminated. And that's just basically what a job contract is, just something that is basically saying the rules and regulations you have to follow once you start the new position.
Buenas tardes, estamos con
David Garde.
David. ¿Tú qué entiendes por contrato de trabajo?
Bueno, un contrato de trabajo es un acuerdo que se celebra entre dos partes en la cual se asignan unas labores específicas o generales y la otra persona recibe una remuneración al realizar esas tareas.
Gracias. Buenas tardes, estamos con
Julio García.
Julio García. ¿Tú qué entiendes por contrato de trabajo?
Contrato de trabajo es algo que convienen dos partes para poder realizar alguna labor.
Buenas tardes, estamos con
Santiago.
Santiago. ¿Tú qué entiendes por un contrato de trabajo?
Un contrato de trabajo depende, puede ser a término indefinido o a tiempo laboral.
En este caso, con respecto al contrato laboral, podemos ver que el 70% de los encuestados sí saben del tema y el otro 30% no saben del tema. What is Workday? Workday is the period during an employer provides his service to an employer in accordance with the employment contract. This time is regulated by law to ensure labor rights and of course, the well-being of workers. Okay, what are the characteristics of the workday here in Colombia? Okay, first, the workday is regulated by the Colombian Labor Code and of course, the Law 2101 of 2021. Which established a progressive reduction of the weekly working hours. Second, currently the maximum work week is 44 hours, distributed over 5 or 6 days, with a maximum of 9 hours per day and a minimum of 4 continuous hours per day. Third one, at least more, one rest day must be guaranteed per week. Generally, every week, this day is the Sunday. The fourth one is that the work hours must be paid in accordance with the contract and of course, and the law, including surcharges for night work and of course for Sundays or public holidays. Okay, which are the types of working schedule here in Colombia? First, the ordinary daytime workday, the schedule is for between 6 a.m. and 9 p.m. Of course, in this case, no additional surcharge applies because there's just the ordinary workday. Okay, night workday. In this case, the schedule is between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. And of course, there is a 35% surcharge. And of course, this applies over the regular hourly wage. The next one is the mixed workday. This one combines daytime and nighttime hours. In this case, if the nighttime portion exceeds 3 hours, the shift could be considered like nighttime workdays. Okay, the next one is the flexible workday. In this case, this allows the 46 week hours to be distributed in shift of 6 to 10 hours without requiring overtime pay in this case. And of course, it's previously agreed upon by both parties. I mean, if you don't talk with your shift and you are not agree with that, it could happen. Okay, the next one is part-time workday. In this case, it's important to understand that is something like a shorter schedule than the legal workday. And in this case, maybe I can use an example like, half time. In this case, the compensation is like that. The worker receives salary and benefits just proportional to the time worked. The next one is the shift work. This means that workers rotate in group. In this case, maybe I can include night shifts, weekends, or holiday, of course, depending of the rotation that you planted with your shift. The last one is the supplementary or overtime work. This means that any hour worked over and beyond the regular workday is considered like an overtime. Okay, let's welcome our special guest. Here is Dr. Andrew Shank, who will talk to us about this topic in the United States.
100% of the pay. That's what's on the table in the United States right now.
One of the issues that we have got to talk about is stress in this country. The fact that so many people are going to work exhausted, physically and mentally.
Maybe it's no surprise that it's Senator Bernie Sanders leading this charge, but the idea of a 4-day work week has some momentum behind it.
Such a fan. It would be life-changing.
Kick the morning off strong by catching up on the 4 years of sleep the corporate world has robbed from me.
I hope this is the new big trend.
The truth is, working class people aren't lazy, they're fed up.
And there's some heavy criticism, too.
If you want to see those same employees really stressed out, just see what happens where their employers lay them off to hire part-time workers instead, or have to close their doors because they cannot make enough revenue.
So how would a 4-day work week actually work? What Sanders wants to do for most Americans is change the standard from 40 hours, 5 days a week, to 32 hours, 4 days a week, without reducing an employee's pay.
In 1940, we came up with a 40-hour work week. 1940. Who is going to deny that the economy has not fundamentally and radically changed over that period of time?
For most salaried employees, this proposal ends up being pretty straightforward. So you get the same annual pay, even though you only work 4 days a week in this case. And across the board, everyone would be entitled to overtime pay, which is paid at time and a half, if they work more than 8 hours in any single day. But let's say you get paid by the hour. Now it's very different. So your wage wouldn't change. You made 20 bucks an hour before, you still make 20 bucks an hour. So a 32-hour a week paycheck looks like $640 if you do the math, and over here it works out to $800. So that's a bit of a difference. If you work more than 32 hours, good news. You get paid time and a half, which is great. If your boss lets you keep up a 40-hour work week, which is 8 hours of overtime, which I think works out to $880. It's not so great if your boss doesn't want to pay that premium.
In some ways, it's almost a wage increase.
For instance, if you have a retail shop, you need coverage. And so perhaps employing more people to cover the same amount of hours that you typically did is going to increase your overall costs.
There are some protections built in to the proposed bill. For example, employers wouldn't be allowed to cut wages or salaries to make up for the extra overtime or the reduced hours. And it wouldn't all happen at once. Every year, for 4 years, the work week would shrink by 2 hours. So you go from 40 to 38 to 36 to 34 and finally to 32. Again, if you work more than those amounts, you get overtime pay. So on the face of it, this might look like employers having to pay more for the same productivity. But there is data to suggest that's not the whole truth. And this could be a win for everybody. Americans and Canadians spend more time at work than people in many other similar countries. On average, people in Iceland, Finland, Belgium, Germany, Denmark, Norway, Austria, and the Netherlands all work less than 35 hours a week. France actually mandates a 35-hour work week and is considering reducing it to 32.
This is something that's been kind of enshrined in the US system since like 1940s, but with other countries trying and experimenting with reducing the hours to like a 35-hour work week, it suggests that Other countries like Canada and the US could also be productive.
And we have seen more and more companies in North America willing to give it a try. One recent pilot recruited 41 companies from Canada and the US and asked each participant to rate a range of factors before and after the 6-month trial, including their self-reported physical health, life satisfaction, mental health, and work-life balance. In every case, the numbers went up, which maybe is like unsurprising, right? Wouldn't we all feel better if we worked fewer hours? But it wasn't just workers that benefited. The companies that took part also reported, on average, a 15% growth in revenue. And every single one planned to keep the policy in place after the pilot ended. Because even working just 32 hours a week, these companies say they were able to get just as much done, sometimes even more.
Productivity actually went up because workers were able to focus on their work. They were not exhausted. They were happy to go to work.
Another recent pilot in the UK involving 61 companies tried more or less the same thing. For these companies, revenue stayed pretty steady. But what they did notice was that both employee turnover and the number of sick days went down.
If you give people this incredible incentive of a whole day of your time a week, they're going to work really hard to become more productive.
But there's another argument Sanders and others are making, and this one's a little more philosophical.
Technology has made working people far more productive. And what has been the result of all of that productivity increase for working people? Almost all of the economic gains of that technological transformation have gone straight to the top.
Part of Sanders' pitch here is that with every single tech innovation, shouldn't we be easing the burden on employees? Workers and businesses have become more and more efficient, producing more in less time. Just think of factory workers churning out parts on an assembly line, or doctors consulting virtually, or just the sheer volume of stuff we're all able to buy and sell online. I mean, look at this graph, measuring how efficiently workers convert inputs, meaning labor, capital, energy, and materials, into the output of goods and services. It's a complicated calculation, but as you can see here, productivity has gone up a lot over the last 70+ years.
One worker is now doing what 12 workers used to do.
And consider how using artificial intelligence could be like adding rocket boots to a company's bottom line.
I think this is like going to be the greatest leap forward that we've had so far, and the greatest leap forward of any of the big technological revolutions we've had so far.
AI means automation. It can think, it can organize, it can find patterns, it can create, it can do the work of people.
With generative AI, we are able to synthesize new texts, new images, new sounds, new videos. This is a sort of creativity, which is kind of baffling.
A recent study by McKinsey predicts by 2030, activities that account for up to 30% of hours currently worked across the US economy could be automated, a trend accelerated by generative AI. So the argument goes, instead of everybody working just as hard as we always do, why don't we ease up a bit?
The question that we are asking today is a pretty simple question. Do we continue the trend that technology only benefits the people on top, or do we demand that these transformational changes benefit working people?
Meaning more leisure time, less stress for the same pay.
It's really hard to predict how AI is going to influence the labor market. But if we do start seeing the elimination of whole categories of jobs, or fewer hours are needed for live humans that are working, then you might see growing societal pressure to try to reduce the work weight.
Now, the main counter-argument is that reducing the amount of work employees do will also make it more expensive for businesses to employ them.
If this policy is implemented, it would threaten millions of small businesses operating on a razor-thin margin.
Remember, if this bill became law, employers would be required to pay their staff overtime for more than 32 hours a week, or 8 hours a day. But there's nothing stopping them from simply giving hourly employees fewer hours or hiring more part-time employees to avoid those costs.
Now they've got the same workers, but only for 3/4 of the time, and they have to hire more. In fact, there's even an incentive for them to dip down so they make everybody part-time, and then they don't have to pay certain penalties.
Also, given the types of companies that are potentially capable of cutting their work week, we could see a divide of the rich getting richer, having more time, and the poor needing to take on 3 part-time jobs in order to pay the bills.
And the idea of requiring overtime pay for anyone who works more than an 8-hour shift, that would be a big change in jobs where long days right now are just kind of part of the gig, right? Public transit, healthcare, emergency services, logistics.
This proposal only works if you reduce 8 hours a work week and have the workers have the same level of productivity that they had at 40 hours. It just doesn't work in many industries.
So let's take healthcare just as an example. One of the most common schedules for nurses in the United States is to work 3 consecutive 12-hour shifts, followed by 4 days off. Under Bernie Sanders' plan, 3 12-hour shifts is 4 hours of overtime a day. That's 1/3 of a nurse's pay that would suddenly be paid at time and a half.
That's going to have a very negative impact on the healthcare community in this country and cause healthcare expenses to go up.
These are among many reasons this bill, in its current form, doesn't really stand a chance of passing. So far, it has the support of just 2 other lawmakers. One of them, Mark Takano, proposed an almost identical bill last year, and that bill got the support of just 7 colleagues in the House.
I don't think it's going to pass in this current iteration, but I think this conversation needs to be had. We're going to have to reallocate a lot of resources, how people do work, when people do work, how are people paid.
Wouldn't we all like the same pay for fewer hours? And there are more and more companies who see this as a way forward. It's just, if you're in the United States, don't expect the government to mandate it anytime soon.
¿Horas a la semana se trabaja aquí en Colombia?
Bueno, normalmente se trabajan 46 horas. Por ejemplo, en mi trabajo, yo trabajo 6 horas diarias, de 5 de la tarde a 11 de la noche. Ahí sumándolas semanalmente, me da que complete las 46 horas.
Hi, Paola, Juan Pablo, and Felipe. Here in the United States, the hours of labor depends if you are being paid by hour or with a salary. The minimum wage in New York City right now is $16.50 per hour. After 40 hours a week, you will be paid time and a half for each hour. So if you work less than 40 hours, you are considered a part-time employee. If you get paid by salary, your pay depends on your experience, education, and skill level. I understand that in Colombia, the minimum wage is a salary rate, while in the U.S., the minimum wage is by hour. And that also depends in the state where you live.
In this case, in the workday, the 50% of the people know about the topic, and the another 50% doesn't know about the topic.
El periodo de prueba es el tiempo inicial dentro de un contrato de trabajo en el que el empleador como el trabajador pueden evaluar si la relación laboral es conveniente para ambas partes. Durante este tiempo, cualquiera de las dos partes puede finalizar el contrato, sin necesidad de justificar las causas, aunque deban respetar los derechos laborales básicos. En resumen, podemos decir que el periodo de prueba es el tiempo inicial dentro de un contrato de trabajo en el que todo el empleador como el trabajador pueden evaluar si la relación laboral es conveniente para ambas partes. Durante este tiempo, cualquiera de los dos puede finalizar el contrato. Vamos a hablar de las características principales. La duración limitada varía según el país y el tipo de trabajo. Por ejemplo, 1 a 3 meses. Debe incluirse por escrito en el contrato. El trabajador tiene los mismos derechos básicos. sueldo, seguridad social, protección contra accidentes. Permite terminar el contrato sin indemnización salvo excepciones. ¿Para qué sirve? Al empleador, para verificar si el trabajador se adapta al puesto, y al trabajador para conocer si el ambiente y condiciones laborales. I am present to you, my guest, a specialist in fixed term and indefinite contracts, Francisco Hems.
And being dismissed or terminated on probation. So in this video, I want to just take a look at probation generally. Probation generally is a term at the commencement of your employment where your suitability for the job is going to be assessed. So the employer is going to assess the new employee's suitability for the job. They may or may not fit into the general ethos of the organization. They may or may not be generally good and right for the organization. That's what it's for. That's what the probation period is for, to assess suitability. Typically, an employment contract will have a clause in it which will say, subject to the successful completion of your probation period, you will be employed as a whatever. Now, the probation period may be 3 months, it may be 6 months. It may also be extended up to or extendable up to 11 or 12 months. So during that period of time, this is a period of assessing for suitability for the employee or of the employee for the job. During the probation period, there should be 1 or 2 reviews at least. In other words, there should be some feedback given to the employee as to how he or she is getting on. An important thing to consider as well, or to understand about the probation period, is that the full panoply of the disciplinary procedure is unlikely to be available or to be applied. It's also the case that other policies, such as the dignity at work policy and the grievance policy or procedure, will not be applied in full. In other words, there may be an abbreviated or truncated version of these policies for somebody on probation, but because you're on probation, you may not necessarily get the full benefit of the normal disciplinary procedure which may apply after you have successfully completed. You need to be aware of that, because a lot of employees contact me and say they didn't tell me what I did wrong, they didn't give me the right to appeal, they didn't bring me through the disciplinary procedure. Most employees on probation, most companies on probation will not, and will make it clear in the contract that they will not be brought through the full disciplinary procedure during the probationary period. So be careful about that, and you need to understand that. The other thing is that you may have a contract of employment with, say, a month's notice in it. That's in the ordinary course of events, and that's after you've completed your probation. Generally, during probation, you'll find that the clause in the contract will make provision for termination of the employment with 1 week's notice during the probation period. So be careful and understand that. The options for employees on probation, because the probation period doesn't last 12 months, and because the probation period doesn't exceed 12 months, and therefore the employee on probation who is dismissed or terminated after 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or indeed 11 months will not have the necessary 12-month service to obtain the benefit of the Unfair Dismissals Act 1977. That being the case, there are very limited options open to an employee who has been dismissed whilst on probation. 2 such options, however, would be: 1, if the grounds for termination during probation was one of the discriminatory grounds, and there's 9 grounds of discrimination. If one of those grounds was, or if the termination was founded on one of those discriminatory grounds, then the employee could bring a claim, because under the employment equality legislation, the discrimination-based legislation, you do not require 12-month service. Another avenue may be under the Protection of Whistleblowers Act of 2000, or Protection of Protected Disclosures Act of 2014. Again, if you're penalised or dismissed for having made a protected disclosure, you don't require or need the full 12 months service. There's no service requirement. Therefore, you could bring a claim if you were fired on probation for having made a protected disclosure. It could be a difficult case to win, though, if you are unable to prove that the reason for your dismissal was the protected disclosure. So, in summary, if you're on probation, it is a period of suitability. The normal full range of procedures and policies will not necessarily apply to you during probation, and you are, quite frankly, in a weak enough position when you're on probation. So the options open to you if you've been dismissed are limited enough. I've made another couple of videos, one at least, about the options, I believe, open to an employee who has been terminated on probation. You might want to check out that video as well, and there's information.
Muy buenos días. Yo entiendo como periodo de prueba donde la empresa evalúa los conocimientos, el desempeño del trabajador. Por lo general las empresas dan un periodo de 2 meses donde se va a evaluar cómo es el desempeño, si la persona cumple, si no cumple. Si en el transcurso de los 2 meses pues la persona no da un buen desempeño, pues se terminaría, digamos, el contrato. En cambio, pues si la persona es una persona que cumple su horario, que es trabajadora, pues la empresa le da la oportunidad de continuar. Esto entiendo como un periodo de prueba.
En nuestras gráficas de periodo de prueba se darán cuenta que el 60% de los encuestados no saben, frente al 40% de los encuestados que sí dieron una respuesta acertada.
Okay, the next topic is what is termination with just cause. In Colombia, termination with just cause that either the employer and the employee ends the employment contract based on a legally and of course a valid reason as defined in the Article 62 on the Colombian Labor Code. In this case, if the employee terminates the contract with just cause, the employer is not required to pay an additional compensation because the dismissal is based on a valid and a legal cause. In this case, the valid and legal reasons for the dismiss could be like serious employee misconduct, like thief, for example, a thief, unjustified absences, violence, and of course, disobedience. Also, a breach of contractual obligation, and of course, being under the influence of substances like drugs in hours in the work, and in working hours, I mean. And of course, maybe something like intentional damage of the company property or equipment. It's important to understand what happened if there is not just cause for the dismiss. Of course, if the contract is terminated without a legally valid reason, then the employee must pay severance compensations, additional compensation to the legal one, to the employee based on the type of contract that he had. We welcome our special guests, the doctors from Sanfiru to Markin ELP Employment Lawyers, who will talk to us about this topic in North America.
A term we often use on the show, in fact, I think every show probably someone mentions it at least once, that is termination for cause. And all you need to know about that topic is what we're going to talk about.
Termination for cause is a terrible situation to be in. If your employment supposedly is terminated for cause, that means the company is saying you did something so bad, then they can let you go without severance. So that's bad enough. But how do you explain that to a prospective employer when you're looking for a job? First question they're going to ask you is, why aren't you with the previous company? Oh, they let me go for cause. Done. You'll not get a job. So we want to talk about what cause is, because in most cases, John, when people are let go for cause, there isn't cause. In fact, they've been wrongfully dismissed.
Well, that's the first question, a deeper definition. What is termination for cause?
Termination for cause happens when an employee is guilty of very significant misconduct, where that misconduct is repeated, and where the company has done everything they can to fix the problem, but they've failed, okay? So it's reserved for the worst offenders. It's the punishment for the worst offenders. The problem is most employers jump the gun. It's not a question of whether you did something wrong. It's a question of whatever it is that you did rises all the way to the level of cause. So because of that, I wanted to understand, you may have done something wrong. It does not mean you can be terminated for cause.
Okay, rise to the level. So the next question naturally would be, how hard is it to establish termination for cause?
It is difficult because again, it's reserved for the worst offender. The company really has to build up its case. Number one, it has to prove that the employee did it. Number two, it has to prove that it was a big deal. But also number three, it has to show that there was no other possibility other than termination. So in other words, they have to show, we've warned this person before, we've warned them again, maybe we've even suspended them. What more can we do now? Nothing. So the only option is termination for cause. Most employers, in my experience, jump the queue. So they go from 0 to 100, from 0 to a termination for cause with nothing in between. That is improper, and again, that's a wrongful dismissal.
You know, we often talk about on the show that, you know, people or someone has a job and it's not, they're doing it out of malice. They're not doing it because they mean to. They just don't happen to be very good at the job. They make numerous mistakes, and eventually their employer says, that's cause. You keep messing up, and I'm getting rid of you.
It is very difficult to terminate someone for cause, let's say for performance reasons. You'd have to show that the employee essentially went out of their way to do a bad job. That's not true for most people. If you do your best, even if things don't work out, it does not mean you could be let go for cause.
So you have two employees. One's a 5-year guy, other's a 20-year guy or girl, and they both apparently get let go for termination for cause. Is there a difference? Does it make a difference how long you've been working for the company?
Well, the longer you work, the more difficult it is to be terminated for cause, because if you've been there for 25 years, presumably you've been there because you've been able to demonstrate you're a good employee. So to show that this good employee all of a sudden becomes so bad they can be let go for cause, you'd have to really, really be able to show as the employer that something awful happened. So it is always difficult to terminate for cause. It's that much more difficult to terminate for cause long service employees.
The next question would be, how many, you know, so-called chances does an employee get before they can be let go for cause?
It really does depend on the offense. As a general rule, I would say 3. So you have 3 forms of discipline before you could be terminated for cause. So maybe a couple suspension or a couple warnings and a suspension, 3 warnings. Now, the more serious the misconduct, the less warnings that employer has to give you. The less serious, the more warnings. But as a general rule, if you've been let go for cause and you haven't been warned in the past, maybe 2-3 times, again, probably a wrongful dismissal.
These warnings have to be in writing, or should they be in writing?
They really should. It's very difficult to warn someone if it's not in writing. My rule, John, if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist.
Termination for cause, all you need to know. That's what we're talking about for the remainder of this segment of the show here. Do you get severance if you're fired for cause? Is there a possibility to get any severance?
Well, if you're legitimately let go for cause, then no, you won't get severance. But again, most people are not properly let go for cause. Most people, when they're let go supposedly for cause, it's really a without cause termination, which means they get full severance. So it could be the difference between getting nothing and getting as much as 2 years' pay. That's why it's so important to get some.
Hey Paula and Felipe, about your question of termination with just cause and whether it includes compensation or severance. When an employer ends a contract with just cause, it usually means the employee did something serious like theft, dishonesty, violence, or constant role violations. In this situation, the company doesn't have to pay severance because the reason for termination is legally valid. But it's so different if the employee decides to leave the job with just cause. For example, if the employer wasn't paid wages, creates a hostile environment, or breaks the term of the contract, the employee may have the right to resign and still receive compensation depending on the labor law of the country. So the key is when the employer ends the contract with just cause, there's usually no severance, but when the employee ends it for a valid reason, there may be. Always check local labor laws because there are rules and can vary a lot from one country to another.
In this case, in the topic of termination of employment contract with just cause, the 77% don't know about the topic. Know about the topic, and the 23% don't know about the topic.